The night of December 3rd, 2025, around 12:41 a.m. Inside a Russian electronic warfare command vehicle, the displays began to thicken under a layer of compressed interference. The signal spectrum slid into the high-power band, pushing the gauge needle to crawl along the red line. For the duty crew, the meaning was unmistakable. Low-altitude airspace had been locked. Ukrainian UAVs would be forced to contract significantly. A few seconds later, feedback appeared in the system. The interference was no longer stable, but oscillated rhythmically, bleeding into the receiving channels themselves. Warnings lit up, status lines everyone could see, but no one read aloud. Synchronization began to slip. Internal communications started to choke. Each time power was pushed higher to hold the electronic cover layer, the entire network had to recalibrate itself. Outside, the antenna mast kept rotating, transmitters maintaining their operating rhythm. The higher the power, the clearer the electromagnetic signature, clear enough for Ukrainian passive sensors to capture the emission bearing in the dark. And at the very moment the Russian EW network reached peak operation, it became the first exposed point. This night, for the Russian side, darkness was the most dangerous UAV shift. Ukrainian drones operated densely under the cover of night, and if low-altitude airspace could not be held, FPV units could punch straight into rear areas within minutes. So along the forward line, they erected a continuous electronic warfare cage. Dispersed jamming stations opening overlapping coverage, a command vehicle coordinating spectrum rhythm, and high-power platforms such as the R330 Zytel, together with Pole 21-type broadcast networks to strip drones of GPS, making positioning unstable. The objective was clear: make drones struggle to receive commands, force them into less agile autonomous flight and easy misalignment. But maintaining that cover required the EW network to strain at full load. The duty cycle was pulled close to maximum, power pushed higher in pulses. From that moment on, each transmitter was no longer just jamming. It began leaving an audible trace. Ukraine did not rush in. They stayed outside, tracking the operating rhythm, waiting for the exact moment when EW output peaked, when drones no longer needed to search for targets, only to fly toward the emission source. So to cross this zone at night, Ukraine did not need to win the sky first. They needed to break the EW cage. Just minutes later, on Russian EW crew screens, target traces appeared along the edge of the coverage zone, 10 to 15 kilometers from the main station cluster. They flew low, 30 to 50 meters, hugging tree lines, splitting into groups of 2 to 4 units and moving in arcs. They did not rush in. They measured the cage. The Russian response followed doctrine precisely. More power pushed. Jamming bandwidth expanded. Auxiliary stations pulled into synchronized rhythm to raise the noise floor, enough to make UAV control channels gasp within roughly 20 to 25 kilometers around the front line. They strained to cover, and the network began to tremble. When multiple emitters hold wide spectrum for too long, the system must constantly self-adjust to avoid receiver overload and overlap. Those adjustments create very short rhythmic gaps, often only 1 to 3 seconds per cycle. The denser the cover, the more regular the gaps, and regular means measurable. Ukraine exploited these exact windows. Passive RF drones listened only for emission direction and duty cycle rhythm. One layer stayed outside the interference zone to keep communications beyond the heaviest noise. The low-flying layer slipped through each gap, advancing a few hundred meters per cycle. Then the first sign appeared. Interference kept rising, but internal communications began to choke. Not an operator error. The EW network was contaminating its own receiving channels. Roughly 10 minutes after the first open windows were exploited, the Russian electronic warfare picture shifted state. On the displays, the noise floor could no longer maintain its initial flatness. It oscillated rhythmically, like a system constantly rebalancing itself to avoid crossing thresholds. The power needle no longer sat pinned near the red line. It flicked downward for an instant, then was dragged back up, repeating with each adjustment cycle. At the operational level, this carried a very specific meaning. The EW network was no longer transmitting according to design, but according to load tolerance, and limits do not negotiate. The longer the cover was held, the more warnings stacked up. Not isolated faults, but cumulative conditions. Synchronization drift between stations, receiver channel overload, and cross-interference bleeding into internal communications themselves. Exchanges between the command vehicle and auxiliary stations stretched by several extra seconds per confirmation. Those seconds were not small. They were distant. For low-flying targets at 30 to 50 meters, moving at 100 to 150 kilometers per hour, each delay was enough for a drone cluster to advance hundreds of meters before a response could close the gap. Inside the command compartment, control behavior began to change. Orders were shortened, explanations stripped away. Not because of panic, but because the channel was no longer clean enough for a long speech. When commands must be cut short to pass through interference, it is no longer a human problem. It is a sign that the system has broken before the humans do. Outside, platforms such as the R330 ZAJ, Zitel, and the distributed Pole 21 broadcast network continued performing their roles, suppressing GNSS, squeezing control channels, holding the noise floor high. But to maintain that state, the EW network was forced to transmit harder, longer, and wider. The duty cycle was held near peak for extended periods, and the electromagnetic signature was no longer faint. It had rhythm, amplitude, and a stable emission direction. As load pressed against the limit, Russia was forced to adjust while already straining. Certain spectral bands were narrowed, priority bands reshuffled, and short-range self-defense fire assets placed on readiness. In theory, this reduced cross-interference. In practice, it was like tuning an engine that was already overheating. Relieve pressure here, and it built elsewhere. They could not fix the system, they could only move the heat. And in that very process, the EW network did what Ukraine was waiting for most. When the power was pushed higher to hold the cover, the emission direction became more stable, power cycles repeated more clearly. For passive RF reconnaissance drones, no decoding was required, only tracking. It was no longer interference. It was a repeating coordinate. The Ukrainian swarm did not rush all at once. It advanced in short segments, exploiting the very brief open windows that appeared when the system self-adjusted to avoid overload. These windows lasted only 1 to 3 seconds, but they repeated evenly. Each cycle, the swarm advanced a few hundred meters without needing continuous communication. Then one missed beat, and everything slipped. One auxiliary transmitter on the edge of the EW cluster fell out of rhythm. There was no large explosion, just one emission point dropping out of synchronization and a void appearing exactly where density should have been highest. One broken beat was enough. The network could not fix it. It could only compensate. And compensation itself was exposure. As load and power shifted onto the remaining nodes, their signatures stepped up another level. Clearer, steadier, easier to track. From that moment, the breaking point formed. The more they compensated to survive, the more they exposed themselves to death. After the auxiliary node fell out of rhythm, the sky did not change color, but the EW network changed state. On Russian screens, the noise field still existed. It was just no longer continuous. It smeared into hollow patches, like torn coverage, then was forcibly compensated with increased load. Each time the network tried to fill the gaps, the remaining nodes had to carry more load. And when they carried it, their signatures became clearer. Not clearer because stronger, clearer because stable. And trackable meant deliverable. Ukraine saw this in purely practical terms. They did not need to defeat interference. They needed to break the structure that kept the interference in the same rhythm. There were no shouts, no wave, only approach vectors. The swarm split into small clusters, each taking a different axis. One cluster advanced toward the Spectrum Coordination Command node, the point that sets transmission schedules, band priorities, and synchronization rhythm. Another closed on high-power platforms, the ones holding the noise floor high. The remaining cluster targeted expeditionary power sources, generators, supply lines, fuel points. not glorious targets on a map, but the points whose loss meant the network could no longer stand together. On the Russian side, defensive reflexes engaged, but were choked by the very system they relied on. Short-range air defense could shoot small targets, but it needed clean channels to classify and track. The EW network was contaminating those channels itself, and in the moment the system had to cover and listen at the same time, it could do neither fully. When the first cluster closed on the coordination node, the choice was no longer shoot or not. It was maintain synchronization or preserve reception. Maintain sync meant increasing transmission. The signature flared like a beacon. Reduce transmission to save receivers, and the cover tore open immediately. Either choice meant loss, shut down and leave a void, stay on and be exposed. Then the coordination node fell. No prolonged explosion was needed to explain it. Once the coordination point dropped out of rhythm, the remaining stations immediately lost their timekeeper. They kept transmitting, but as isolated entities, overlapping each other, fouling their own receivers. And in that moment, the EW network did not die by fire. It died by choice. When power was pulled down to save hardware and preserve the last communication lines, the sky did not grow brighter. UAVs did not search for signals. They read structure. What had previously been submerged in noise, trench lines, staging areas, maneuver axes, suddenly appeared at true scale. Without an electronic cover, night depth vanished. The distance from the low sky to the rear areas was no longer a problem to solve. Russia's final reflex was to restart individual stations, trying to patch the cover with disconnected fragments. But restarting was not restoration. It was transmitting another signature cycle. It was sending another bearing. It was hanging another marker on the opponent's map. At the end of the phase, the EW network might still have a few nodes running, but the cage had lost its function. It is no longer locked at night. It only emitted scattered traces of a system that had been rhythm broken, then structure cut while trying to compensate. And in modern warfare, the most dangerous moment is not when a system shuts down. It is when it tries to come back on. When the high transmission rhythm dropped, Ukrainian reconnaissance UAVs began rescanning the area from a safe altitude. What emerged was not a silent zone, but a network that had just been forced to pay a price. During roughly 20 to 30 minutes of operation near threshold, the electronic warfare layer, once considered continuous cover, had turned into a chain of RF hotspots with repeatable bearings. Positions that had transmitted most strongly now left clear traces, abrupt maneuver paths, transmitter emplacement points, and abnormal silent patches where the system was forced to shed load. Losing just 1 to 2 coordination nodes was enough for the night cover structure to collapse in a cascading effect. Instead of a continuous canopy, the battle space fractured into hollow stretches several kilometers long, sufficient for a swarm to slip through rhythmically without direct confrontation. The visible damage lay in the platforms that were struck, but the most expensive loss was not fire or hardware failure. It lay in operational data, duty cycles, band priorities, on-off patterns, and how the EW network reacted under forced load. Once those patterns were read, subsequent waves no longer needed to probe from scratch. They would be faster, cheaper, and aimed directly at the points the network could no longer endure. This night did not prove electronic warfare useless. It proved something colder. EW does not die, but EW that stands still does. When a network must hold its duty cycle near peak to cover low airspace, it not only generates interference for the enemy, it generates a shape of itself. And that shape, in modern warfare, is something that can be tracked, measured, and used to guide weapons all the way in. At the moment, an EW network is forced to choose between transmitting to cover and transmitting to expose. Electronic advantage is no longer a shield. It becomes an operational risk equation. Every compensating pulse is a pulse of self-exposure. Every restart is another bearing sent into the sky. The remaining question is not who transmits harder. It is who stays silent at the right moment longer.